I'm going to sing you some songs just to kind of get you in the mood. And if you want to take these for love songs, it's okay. Opportunity to introduce a relative who has helped pave the way for many of us in the field of culture-based science, a professional whose record is teacher as researcher, speaks for itself in terms of accomplishments for students, teachers, and community. People in the audience, let's put our hands together to welcome Dr. Gregory Cajete.
Thank you, Cornell. That was a really just very gracious introduction. Thank you for that. Wow, it's just really a pleasure to be up here. Last week I was involved with all things graduation at the University of New Mexico, and if you're a teacher and a director, you know you have to go to all of these various functions. So I was going to maybe 4 or 5 functions, 5 functions actually, during most of last week, and major kinds of university things. So it's a pleasure to get back into the swing of just presenting and teaching and talking. And my background is actually pretty extensive. I began my career actually not as a teacher, but as a field biologist. And I worked for the state of New Mexico in doing plant studies and terrestrial ecology studies. I was trained essentially as a general biologist, a general scientist, and I basically entered into teaching almost as an afterthought, in the sense that I thought, well, I'll go to school, I'll teach for a couple of years, and then I'll get my master's and PhD and go on in the sciences. But once I started teaching, I felt that that was my calling. And that was way back in 1974. So I've been a teacher ever since, primarily starting out as a teacher of science, and then of course expanding into a variety of different kinds of areas of education. I'm also a self-taught artist, as many Pueblo people are. And I put myself through school through doing lots of work in jewelry in those days, which was pretty lucrative in some ways as a profession. But in any case, that's basically my connection to the IAIA, in the sense that I had interacted with the IAIA Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe as a student, when I was in Santa Clara. So what brings me here today? Well, it's this presentation, Rebuilding Sustainable Indigenous Communities, Applying Native Science. It's a presentation that actually I've given probably all over the world at this point in time over the past 5 years. The most recent place was Taiwan, where I was invited to give a presentation to various schools who themselves are starting an Indigenous studies program around the Indigenous peoples of Taiwan as well. So indigeneity and Indigenous studies actually is evolving and growing even as we speak in various countries all over the world. And because we in the United States have been doing Indigenous studies for a while, they tend to look to us for guidance and for example. I'm not sure we give good examples sometimes, but nonetheless there's a history that we have with Indigenous studies. And so very much this lecture, this presentation is part of the evolution of Indigenous studies. in the sense that as Indigenous people are beginning to find their place within Western academic settings like universities, as they are creating their own schools in the sense of the tribal schools, the tribal colleges, the charter schools, the various tribal schools that are forming on many reservations in many places in the United States and Canada, and also actually all over the world now as well. You're beginning to see kind of what I would call the rise of the Indigenous mind, in the sense that part of the movement of many Indigenous people has been to reclaim not only a space within the context of education as we know it, Western education, but actually to bring forward their own ideas, their own philosophies, their own understandings of what education is for them. So very early on, as I was teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts, one of the presidents of the Institute called me in. His name was Lloyd Kivanyu, and I was just a young teacher, and he asked me to create a curriculum for the students that were going to the Institute that integrated science with art, with cultural perspectives of the students that were going to the Institute at that time. And this, of course, was students from all over the United States, you know, at various levels, socioeconomic status, reservation students, and also students that were 2 or 3 generations in an urban setting. So we had a variety of mix of Native students, even at that time, attending the Institute. And his challenge to me was to actually create a science curriculum that was relevant to those students. They were artists. They were coming from cultural communities who had a history of science. They were creative learners in the sense that they would be called non-traditional learners. They were highly talented in a variety of different areas of the arts. And I was to put together a curriculum that made sense, you know, within that setting, and sort of drew from what we knew and understood to be the cultural heritage, the cultural histories of the various tribes that those students represented. So very early on, you know, in 1974, I was asked to in a sense, I was given an assignment by this old gray-haired Cherokee guy, Lloyd Kivanyu, who was very famous in his own right as a fabric artist, one of the first Native fabric artists in the United States to make it actually in kind of the world of fashion, so to speak, the worldwide of fashion, who then became president of the Institute. And so I began in 1974 actually to construct, as teachers will, a curriculum that integrated science with art with the cultural perspectives of students from the Institute. And that eventually formed the foundation of my dissertation, which then formed in 2000 this book called Igniting the Sparkle, which is really my dissertation in a undissertationed languaged form. That sort of documents what I did at the Institute, how I created a science course or sequences of science courses that were predicated and based on Indigenous thought, values, core traditions, and Indigenous knowledge. As I did this curriculum, I realized that I was coming from some place. And that some place, of course, is your cultural place. That I also embodied many of the cultural traditions of my people, the Pueblo people of New Mexico, and more particularly the Tewa people in New Mexico, who are an ancient people in that place, anywhere from 10 to maybe 12,000 years, continually living in that area of the Southwest. And also related to the Kiowa in some ways as well, because they were our cousins coming down from the north, also settling in places adjacent to us. So we have a long history of relationship and a long understanding of the places in which we've lived. And so that I knew I was coming from a place. And so what this, which is essentially a curriculum dissertation, led to was really a deeper exploration of that place I was coming from, which is the cultural, historical traditions and foundations of indigenous science, indigenous understandings of the natural world. And that's what led to this first book, actually, because this was the first book I wrote way back in 1989, 90, 91, when I was working on this book. And it's called Look to the Mountain, An Ecology of Indigenous Education. So this book is essentially an epistemology of how you come to know what you know from a cultural standpoint. And what I've tried to do is sort of incorporate my knowledge and understanding of Native studies, Native history, cultural anthropology, sociology, philosophy of education, and sort of put them all into this kind of woven basket of something that I could articulate as being an epistemology upon which this curriculum was based. And so that work, began all those many years ago. Since that time, I've written 4 other books. The most available book right now is Native Science, Explorations and Interdependence. My most recent book is actually Neurophilosophy and Indigenous Wisdom, which was co-authored with Four Arrows, who also goes by the name of Don Jacobs, okay? So you can also Google that. So I just wanted to give you those perspectives, in the sense of where I'm coming from in this particular presentation, because it really is the almost visual outline of my next book, which will begin to talk about indigenous community, creating sustainable indigenous community, and really, I would say, also trying to communicate the importance of understanding in a much, much deeper way the nature of human community, and how in many ways we have to actually begin to come back to those very specific kinds of understandings of relationship, of relationality, of being of place, of being stewards of the places in which we live, the very deep ecological underpinnings, if you will, that all cultures of the world have had, indigenous cultures continuing those traditions into the present. But nonetheless, all cultures of the world have had this understandings, these perspectives at one time or another in their histories. And so, rebuilding sustainable indigenous community. This is a 1,000-year-old Anasazi plate. The Pueblo world actually was very large, pre-Columbian, anywhere from 500 AD to about 1300 AD. It extended all the way from what is called Las Vegas, Nevada today, all the way through Utah and Colorado and down into Casas Grandes, Mexico. North and south, it would have gone all the way to what we would near Liberal, Kansas, actually, and westward probably all the way to close to the California tribes, somewhere in mid Arizona. So it was a huge territory, what we would call the ancient Anasazian Mogollon Mimbres complex of peoples at that time. And so the Mimbres people were the southern part of that kind of huge confederation that existed one time. They ceased to exist, at least in terms of tangible communities, about 1200 AD. We don't know why. It could have been a result of them simply just breaking apart and moving on to other tribes, becoming other tribes. It could have been disease. It could have been ecological stress, or a combination of all of those. But the only thing they left us was the record of their mythic life, the record of their life as represented in their pottery. And so throughout southern New Mexico, parts of southern Arizona, and into Mexico, you find Mimbres plates like this. And the Mimbres plates are world famous because they, in a sense, tell the story of the Mimbres, even though they didn't keep a a written record of their history, we can begin to piece together at least something of the essence of their life and their tradition. Now, from this plate, well, what can you tell me, anyone in the audience, what can you tell me that's unique about this design and that might tell you something about how the Mimbres understood themselves in relationship to the world?
There's a human and natural relationship to the bird.
Yeah, okay, there's definitely a human and a sandhill crane in this case. Anything else? Any people in design or art? Yeah.
There's kind of a decent balance between the curves and the lines.
Okay, so there's balance. There's a balance there. That's another good term. Yeah. Anyone else? Any photographers that use these design techniques? Yeah.
It seems to be just one continuous line, just interplaying light and dark. I don't know if it actually is, but that's what strikes me.
Well, you're exactly right. That's what I was after also, in the sense that it's not two designs. It's not a human and an animal drawn separately, but it's actually what we call a positive negative, using positive negative space, darkened space, and space left devoid of color. But it's just one line. And what it represents is kind of the essence of epistemology is that it's embedded in the symbols that we create in art. It's embedded in the songs that we sing. It's embedded in the structures that we build. It's embedded in the ways in which we create communities. And so what it shows is embeddedness of a epistemology. And that epistemology, basically, if you were to put it into words, is saying we are, the human being is the sandhill crane, and the sandhill crane is the human being, that there is interdependence and interpenetration of those two life forces. And if you look at indigenous art forms all over the world, you'll begin to see certain kinds of symbols, certain kinds of ways of presenting these kinds of forms that sort of give you the indication of what the embedded epistemology, where they're coming from. And it's really kind of the archetype epistemology for indigenous people. We are the sandhill crane is us. You can't pull the two apart. We are related in that deepened way. And so in the presentation that I'm going to give you that deals with community, when I studied native science, of course, you know, native science has to it a technology or forms of technology, and it's unique to each tribe, each tribal group, you know, approaches and ways of fishing, ways of hunting, ways of creating shelter, ways of finding food. You know, all of these can be considered native science, but all of that activity of applied science, if you will, ways of agriculture, happens from a certain place. It's founded on something, which we call in epistemology a worldview, a way of understanding yourself. And so when it comes to community, that is especially apparent. So one of my colleagues, two of my colleagues, Cheryl Charles and Bob Samples, wrote a book a few years ago called Coming Home, in which they describe healthy communities that as being cultural and natural systems where life and learning are nourished by the actions of members. This enables peaceful and sustainable futures. We begin with one core community, but become members of many other kinds of community through time. This now puts us into another kind of setting, in the sense that epistemology does matter. The stories you tell about the world you live in matter. The stories that guide you in the way you interact with the world matter. And so when you contrast indigenous thinking, indigenous epistemologies, indigenous stories with Western, and I should say Western up to a certain point, especially the Industrial Revolution, but stories of modernity, there's a stark contrast between the stories that guided, let's say, the Mimbres, and the stories that guide us today. And they're basically based on metaphors. And these metaphors are metaphors or more particularly, I would say that what guided the indigenous people, particularly the example I gave you of the Mimbres, was that metaphor of the interpenetration of the sandhill crane and the human being is a metaphor of life, a metaphor of relationality between human life, in this case animal life, and bird life. And so when one looks at the metaphors that stories are about, that are sort of entwined in stories, you begin to find that embeddedness of epistemology as well. So biological metaphors are alive, mechanical metaphors are dead. Metaphors influence how we think and the ways in which we affect others. The metaphor essentially that guides you is one of the most essential components of the way you perceive and understand a community and what a community is for. Today, probably more than any other time in our history, there is a compelling need for us to understand community in not only the biological, ecological sense of what it is to be a human community, but also certainly in terms of the social, political, and economic ramifications of that metaphor of community. As people, we're searching for meaning. We lack a sense of the common good. We struggle without recognizing the need for that communal virtue and ethical action. And a healthy society, I missed the why, can only come from healthy communities comprised of self-determining individuals acting and taking responsibility for their actions for all. And this is also coming from Cheryl Charles. And this definition of community, I think, comes really close to what I think indigenous communities were about, during the time of the Mimbres. Again, the essence of community, its very heart and soul, is the non-monetary exchange of value, things we do and share because we care for others and for the good of the place. It arises from a deep, intuitive, often subconscious understanding that self-interest is inseparably connected with community interest. And that comes from De Hoc, Birth of a Cardotic Age. There are certain requirements of community: a perception of belonging, which supports your sense of identity. It places our identity in context. It requires participation and commitment. It requires the support of individuals, which in turn supports individuals. And it obtains a synergy through which it attains a kind of coherence as all of the parts start working together and supporting each other and interacting with each other. You have what we call coherence in terms of a process. And you can certainly see this in natural communities. You can also see this in human communities. When community is happening, you know it, you feel it, you become, in a sense, engaged in it. And so part of this lecture is really what I had to do very much in terms of looking at Look to the Mountain. Its subtitle is An Ecology of Indigenous Education. Was I had to look at the ecology of how everything was sort of woven together in traditional times that created not only community but also created the foundation for education in community. And so as I began to study communities themselves, I realized that there was also a kind of if you would say maybe a roadmap in how actually there's an anatomy to communities. And that anatomy is something that you can begin to look at in some very particular kinds of ways to help you understand its coherence. Here in the Northwest, it should be beginning about this time. You have the peoples here in the Northwest celebrating the first salmon ceremonies, which are very ancient ceremonies, probably 10, 15,000 years old, and these are ceremonies which celebrate the coming of the salmon into their spawning streams and lakes, you know. And it celebrates very much like that Mimbres plate. It celebrates that interdependence of human beings with something that gives them life, that provides them the foundation of life. It also helps them to remember who they are as a people, because there's lots of songs and there's lots of exchange of gifts that happen as a result of that. There's a lot of remembering of personal as well as communal history. And there's a celebration of that connection that the people have to the salmon. And in a sense, the responsibility people also have to maintain that kind of natural symbiotic relationship between themselves and the salmon. And the needs of the salmon are supported by humans. The humans and the needs of humans are supported by the salmon. And so it's much more complex. I mean, you can just take any one of these ceremonies, like the first salmon ceremony, and begin to look at it in terms of its embedded epistemology. And as a result of that, it'll lead you to everything else, especially to those key guiding principles of community. And so, recreating Indigenous education includes teaching and learning which is transformative and anticipates change and innovation. Indigenous education, I think, can integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate traditional environmental knowledge. And Indigenous education forms a foundation for community renewal and revitalization. And so that painting by an Iroquois artist, I think, really reflects that connection that Indigenous people attempt to create and recreate through generations between themselves and the sources of their life. That brings us to this other adage, which has become more apparent than ever before. We are all related, we are all related, we are all members of Turtle Island. And of course, the stories and ideas of Turtle Island are shared in a variety of ways by all the tribes in the United States. And they're expressed in a variety of ways by the tribes. It's based on the idea that we are indeed all related, that we all, in a sense, have a relationship not only to each other, but also to those plants and to those animals and to those places in which we have lived and which, in a sense, we have participated in the life process of. So this is one of my colleagues, Manuelita Lovato, who's from Santo Domingo, Pueblo, who's a sculptor, ceramic sculptor, artist, and she has all the indigenous peoples of the world, you know, associated with that particular sculpture. And the idea, of course, of Turtle Island is that we are, you know, that the Earth is this giant living being, that it feels, she registers all the human acts that have happened through time, and that she herself has a life process that has to be supported as she supports our life process. And so these stories, you see, are repeated over and over by different indigenous traditions all over the world. One of the things I found as I studied, you know, I am a trained biologist, so as I look at how indigenous people, in a sense, through their metaphor, through their story, through their ways of looking at themselves in relationships to plants and animals and places, a tradition that I'm also a part of, I realized, in a sense, that the indigenous story of the natural world is probably more complex than the Western story, and that the other piece that I realized was that story has yet to be told in its full entirety. And so part of the work that I'm doing now is as I work with Native science and as I work with curriculum, I try to help students, you know, explore that story in a little bit deeper way and make that relationship between science and art and cultural perspective and epistemology. We also have to take a look at our complicity. As concerned people, we have to take a long, hard look, an honest look at the current educational, economic, governmental, and community development policies, planning, and processes which many times make us complicit with the status quo. And I think more now than ever before, these kinds of questions have to be asked, not only at universities like this, but also university where I work from, you know, because in a sense, much of what we've been teaching for, and itself has a history, has been for essentially creating empire, as opposed to creating earth community. And there's a big difference in ways that you teach for both. And so when I talk about this, this is a major kind of very sensitive issue within universities, because universities are one of the biggest perpetuators of education for empire. And of course it moves us into critical studies, and it moves us into all of the kinds of issues that Indigenous people still have with higher education and still have with the whole notion of education. But I asked you to think about that as you think about what I'm saying about community. In order to understand Earth community, you have to understand it from that perspective, from the perspective of the stories and the understandings of the people that have lived in relationship to the land in ways that have been sustainable. And that's the big clash, you see. Even now as a university professor, I have major debates with other professors from other disciplines, whether they be biology, sociology, political science, economics, over this issue of what paradigm does the university teach and what paradigm is the university based on. And if we're going to really change universities, you have to first change the paradigm that it teaches from, that it's based on. And so that debate maybe will go on beyond our lifetimes, but I hope that's a debate that eventually takes another turn, because the issues that we face today in terms of global climate change, and I'm talking as a biologist now, and part of the conference I went to in Taiwan actually dealt with global climate change in Asia and the impacts and the effects of, you know, that part of the world in terms of how it's being affected by you know, extreme weather and all of the kinds of systemic effects that has. The most recent of which was the tsunami and the earthquake in Japan. And the Japanese people who are actually handling that situation were at the conference as well. Tells us that there's a limit to the paradigm that we're teaching for. In other words, the conclusion of the conference was that there's a limit to what we can do to mitigate the issues of how just global climate change or disasters like the tsunami and the earthquake. There's limits that the system that we currently operate from and around can take. And you saw kind of the immediate effects of the tsunami on the Japanese system. Multiply that worldwide and see what happens. So we have to begin to teach, and the conclusion, I should say, the conclusion of all of us who were debating and talking was that we have to change in the education system towards something else. We didn't know what that something else is. We don't know what that something else is, but we know that we've reached the limits of what we can do with our current way of teaching, our current way of handling these kinds of crises, and that we have to begin to look at things differently. First of all, the other thing that was very apparent is that our communities are too large. Our cities are too large. They're unsustainable. And so all of the kinds of ripple effect questions, of course, happen in those kinds of conferences where you leave with more questions than answers. So that's the impetus behind this, you see, is that this idea of complicity is there. You know, we are all complicit, including myself, you know, because I just got here by a U.S. Air, you know, flying through the air. And so we have to begin to think about those questions, especially in terms of education. What do human communities do for us? They give us a sense of purpose. They give us an agreement on core values. They require participation, communication, commitment, collaboration and trust, conscious choice, shared responsibility. They, again, acceptance, accountability, respect, reciprocity, again, accountability and efficacy, you know, are things that, in a sense, compose the threads of any community that is operational. So as I took those ideas, you see, and then I'm asking myself the question, the research, okay, so what do I do with this understanding of indigenous histories of communities, indigenous epistemologies of communities, current status in terms of the global climate change and all the challenges that we face today in modern society, in terms of just, you know, just scratching the surface of sustainability. What does that mean for indigenous education? Because I am an indigenous educator. For me, it means educating for recreation of cultural economies around an indigenous paradigm. For me, it means begin by learning the history and principles of our indigenous ways of sustainability and exploring ways to translate that into the present. For me, it means research and the practical ways to apply these indigenous principles and knowledge bases to real life situations that we face today. Among my people, and this is true of any indigenous people you find in the world, everyone has an implicit understanding of what community is. They do it all the time, you know. It has been affected by colonization to one extent or another in terms of different indigenous peoples, but most indigenous people still have a sense of what community is. And so for us, in Tewa country, we have a metaphor. It's in English, in Tewa, it is hung indagimu, hung indagimu. We are all but corn. Or more particularly, we are all but kernels on a corn cob, on the same corn cob. And so the kernels on this corn cob, you can see, are the individuals. They're individually shaped. They have an individually colored hue to them. Their characteristic is that they lean up against another kernel on the corn cob. The corn cob is the structure of the community. The kernels are the individuals which make up the community. And through time, each of these, of course, will become its own corn plant. So it's a metaphor of what is community. Community is relationship in a structure that is interdependent and is mutually supporting one another. Where the individual is still an individual, but the individual is in relationship to other corn kernels around it, and also in relationship to the corn cob itself. At the University of New Mexico, when I became director 10 years ago, first we started from scratch, and I started hiring different faculty. But we had an implicit idea of what Native studies could be or should be. And so we claimed the space of calling ourselves a community-based Native Studies program. Community-based Native Studies program. Now, to do that in a Research One university, to even use the word community in a Research One university, in that to actually say we're going to apply community in the formation of a department, a university department, is something of an interesting task. But we said we have to say that we're going to, even though we don't know exactly what that means, we have to say we're going to do it so that we can do it, so that we can actually do it. So 10 years later, I have to say we're beginning to do it. We're actually beginning to be a community-based Native Studies program. It's very different than being a discipline-based Native Studies program, which owes most of its connections to other disciplines like history, anthropology. Although those disciplines do add, content to Native Studies, what we've said is we're declaring our own self-determination. And we're saying we have a story to tell. That story is based in our past, our present, and our future. And we have to do it. And so that is essentially what we're doing right now, attempting to create, move students towards this vision of health, renewed and revitalized, sustainable, economically viable Indigenous communities. We understood that we had to develop a sense of principles that we could operate from. And all of this, the title of my presentation is Native Science. All of this involves Native science. All these different stages involves reclaiming, relearning, applying again forms of our Indigenous Native science to different kinds of tasks, integrating it with Western science, if necessary, and other disciplines. So, culture, community, and resources, ecological integrity was one thing we needed to start from the premise that what you do has integrity and honors life-giving relationship. The other metaphor that's used commonly by Indigenous people is we do this for life's sake. And so the word life itself is an integral part of how community is actually conceived. It's for life's sake, it's because of life, it's for life's sake. And acts and behavior within that community also, in a sense, embody that metaphor. So sustainable orientation was another key principle. Build in a process which sustains community and culture in place. Vision and purpose, have a vision and purpose, see what you can do in the light of revitalization of community. This is Pueblo community circa 5000 AD, or 500 AD rather. And this is Taos Pueblo circa 2000 AD. There have been changes, but still the same concept of community still pervades. And this is something you don't say in many areas of education, but that everything is guided by spiritual purpose. Now, I'm not going to break that down into religious purpose. Spiritual purpose is a different kind of thing altogether. And so cultural integrations, actions originate through spiritual agency that stems from connections to a cultural way of being. Respect for all, actions stem from respect for and celebration of community. Engaging participation of the community becomes another key element. The community is both the medium and the beneficiary of the activities of whatever education process you are engaged in. Acoma Pueblo, a spring right under that rock where the woman is gathering water from, a very sacred place for the Acoma people. Relationship, another key element of this idea. Building upon and extending relationships are essential to this process of development. Restoring and extending the health of the community is the key goal. And every initiative should generate dynamic and creative process. So each initiative develops another creative initiative, develops yet another creative initiative. Now, a lot of what I'm talking to you about is actually natural systems theory, as you actually see it happening within living, vital, natural communities. And one of the things that I found out early on and was kind of embedded in my own thinking was that traditional Native communities always mimicked, always attempted to integrate what they understood to work in the natural world. So they saw the natural world, they saw how communities were formed, they saw the interactions between plants and between animals and between place, and they tried to mimic that in the way that they created and they expressed community. And so it's going back to those ideas again, of course, you know, circa 2011, to begin to think about how can we recreate communities in this more kind of cohesive and natural, sustainable way. All of this, of course, requires commitment to developing necessary skills, commitment to community renewal and revitalization, commitment to natural or mutual reciprocal action, and transformative change. The woman is winnowing corn. The principles that we share in common are place-based adaptive systems. You know, as I said, indigenous communities were based on basic principles of complex adaptive systems. We still have resourcefulness, industriousness. We still have collaboration, or at least the ability to collaborate and cooperate, to integrate difference in political organization, build alliances, confederation building, trade and exchange. These are things you have to teach for today. In earlier times, they happen just because of the process of the community, but today you actually have to teach for these, because people don't know how to do even basic things like cooperate and collaborate, especially universities. Especially universities. So you actually have to teach for this. Challenges, you know, for this kind of indigenous paradigm, of course, for us is establishing political self-determination, continuing to work on our decolonization and creating culturally responsive education, taking our own look at our own economic exploitation, diverse and competing ideologies, political restructuring, understanding the nature of individual diversity, identity, redefinition, creating. You see, all of these things also happen in the course of the courses we teach in Native Studies at UNM. And the students are involved in actually realizing how these things are happening within their communities, within themselves. So a lot of what we try to do is bring about self-knowledge as the first foundation. There is lots of fragmentation, cultural, social, and otherwise, spiritual. We still are in the process of creating formal and informal institutions which advance sustainability. Most places are just beginning the task of actually creating truly sustainable coursework, truly sustainable programs. We're just at the very beginning of that as well. Political restructuring when necessary. But one of the things I found, you know, as I studied all this, you know, bringing past and present together in some interesting kinds of ways, and looking at the different ways that things had changed or not had changed or had not changed, was that earlier communities, Native communities, were able to do some of these things in very elegant ways. And so that impressed me to such an extent, much more, you know, open and cohesive types of community organizations. They were able to adapt to different situations as they came up. So they had a resilience, is what I'm saying, that we do not have today. We don't have resilience in terms of communities. So we have things like extended families, clans, and tribes, the community, place or region, political, social, professional organizations, co-ops, federations. And I get in trouble for this one. Even the corporation can be sustainable if founded on principles of sustainability, but it's changing the story that the corporation operates from. It's the difference between empire and earth community. Empire and earth community. Big difference. But the corporation actually is a kind of subset of community as well. So for me, you know, these are some of the areas that we've started to sort of really explore in terms of our research. food traditions, the family itself, the community, indigenous relationships, health, education, the whole notion of the celebration of life, to try to bring some of those ideas and back and to actually make them themes for research in our programs. All of this really being guided by the notion that we are indeed kernels in the same corn cob. Now, while I'm focusing on Native studies, I'm focusing on Indigenous studies, I'm focusing on Indigenous communities, the principles, the ideas of the, in a sense, recreation of these communities, this way of community education has ramifications beyond just the Indigenous population. That it really is a social, kind of social educational reconstruction that we have to begin to engage ourselves in some very new and different ways. So if we can provide as Indigenous people through a small Native studies program here at Portland State or there in Albuquerque, New Mexico, just one exemplification of something that actually does work, with regard to these kinds of ideas, then I think we've made some progress and hopefully begin to model some of the possibilities for the kinds of transformations and transitions that we must make in the next generation, or we're just not going to make it, guys. The truth is our grandkids are going to have a woefully degraded world that they will inherit. And being a grandpa, 3 weeks old, this is an impetus for me, even more so, to really just do what I can, as in the place and position that I'm in, to sort of perpetuate something of the seed, this idea, into not only what we do in Native studies, but also hopefully what we do in higher education as a whole. So with that, wikunda bihan biwatsi hiwa newagipo baiki wikunda. He woni ansha dimani, he woni pini dimani, he woni tuni dimani. Navit awagi, naviha wigi hiwa newagipo jina taratha. What I said in my language, Tewa, is thank you for sharing your breath of life with me. I hope I've given you good thought, good word, good feeling, as we come together in this place, in this time for this purpose. And hopefully my words will have some meaning for you in some time or some part of your life. So thank you so much. And I think we do have some time for questions. Do we have some time for questions? Yeah. I know it's really hot in here, so I know I'm sweating up here. But that's what happens with community too, you see. You have to be able to sort of, we're all breathing each other's thoughts and ideas and perspectives. Yeah.
Can you comment on what appears to be the case, that what you believe about global warming these days depends on the political party you belong to, not on the scientific knowledge that you have?
How can I comment? We've had our own traditional elders who, I grew up with stories that this time would come, and my grandmother grew up with stories that this time would come. There have been stories among all Indigenous people that these times would come. And so we've had sort of our own political commentators, that have, through time sort of predicted many of these situations coming to pass. As a biologist, I'm able to read the reports and read the research, and so there's no doubt. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, as a biologist, that we are in the throes of global warming. I'm coming from where the weather should be like this, like it was today in New Mexico, where we're having like not torrential rains. I wish we were having some rain, but we're having you know, 40, 50, 60, 70-mile-hour winds. We're having dust storms. It's cold. It's cold. It's in the 50s when it should be in the 70s and 80s. And this has been gradually happening, you know, over the years, you know, and you go to any part of the world and you'll find pronounced change in the climate and in the weather patterns. And this is just the beginning. You know, this is just the beginning of this process. And so that we know, and our data shows us, you know, that the climate is changing. We don't have really at this point the knowledge to understand exactly how, because it's such a huge systemic, you know, change that's going on, how it's changing, but we know that we can see it changing, we can show that it's changing. So, you know, to use at this point in time, you know, the notion that we are not in global climate change is rather ridiculous and rather self-serving by whoever uses it. I think what politicians should be talking about is how can we begin to recreate ourselves in ways that will help us to become more resilient, you know, in the face of those kinds of changes that are upon us. And they're coming very fast, much faster than any of the you know, scientists who are studying this have been able to predict, because it's a cumulative effect. You know, one thing affects another thing, affects another thing, affects another thing, and eventually you have this avalanche, basically, of change. So, I guess, you know, as a professor, a tenured professor at the University of New Mexico, I can at least espouse the fact that, you know, guys, we have to change, not only in terms of what we understand that we're doing in our programs and our curriculums, but actually how we're teaching students. Creative process, interdisciplinarity, the ability to think outside the usual theoretical boxes, but not neglect them, but to use them creatively. All of these are skills that we have to develop in our students. Not these boxed kind of assembly line, you know, representations of kind of the old school ideas, because they're not working anymore.
I don't necessarily want to be the devil's advocate, but it does seem like this is fairly idealistic in that, I mean, you were discussing about how cities are too large to sustain themselves. Well, I mean, it's not feasible for people to break off into various sects, you know, and then recreate community. It seems too simplistic.
Well, I present it, you know, because I think, first of all, when you're just beginning ideas, they have to be in a very basic and simple form, so that you first can understand that. But certainly, I don't think that this can be achieved easily. That there's a huge amount of science. Even just the conferences I told you I came from in Taiwan, we had top scientists from throughout Asia, you know, with a variety of different kinds of strategies that were very well developed from at least the current knowledge that we have about how to handle. But again, we were reaching points where we didn't have any answers anymore. And so what I'm saying is that, yes, it does begin as a vision, but it does have to then flesh down into the realities of how you actually go about doing in different places, in different situations, how you begin to address, you know, these tremendous changes and tremendous stresses that cities are under.
Maybe it was that I just didn't see what step one was.
Well, again, you know, step one for me is that you have to first have a sense of the vision, the concept, the idea. But yes, there has to be, you know, a stepwise kind of strategy developed for each of these kinds of scenarios and situations. And we're just not there yet, is what I'm saying. We're beginning the process, and I think we're debating and talking and reflecting, which is really what has to happen in almost any situation. And then you begin to say, well, let's try this, let's apply this strategy. You begin to work out each strategy, you know, almost situation by situation. So that's where the simplicity ends and the complexity definitely begins, you know, when you actually begin to flesh these ideas out into reality. Yeah.
in terms of the paradigm shifting in universities, I teach here, and I'm wondering what challenges you've met within the School of Education. You know, your ideas are really big, and are they mainly through the Native American studies, or you have collaborators in the School of Ed that you are working with and trying to move some of these ideas beyond?
Well, we do. I do have collaboratives in the School of Ed, but it's primarily, you know, creating a Native Studies program. And interesting you asked that question is because of the budget cuts and issues, we are actually in University College, which is not College of Ed, but now we're being asked to find a new academic home, and College of Ed probably is the home that we will end up going to. So some of the question that you've just asked, just as the details now are going to have to be solved if that's indeed the case for us, that there has to be kind of a negotiation of what kinds of things we can do within the College of Ed that, you know, still allow us to do what we're doing and what we're starting to do with this process. So ask me 5 years from now to see if it's successful, if I'm even still there by 5 years from now. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Wewina. You talk in your book about Native science, and you say, guess what? There's no word for science in most Native languages. So how do you bridge that paradigm with those who come from a Western scientific tradition to try to grasp the fact that there's no word for science in your language?
Yeah, you know, it's really playing with language and semantics. You know, there's not a word for science, but there's certainly an understanding of science among Native people in the sense, even in the sense of observation and in the sense of looking at how patterns work within the environment, beginning to base your understanding on how to use technologies in certainly productive ways. There's a variety of, there's measurement, you know, there's the same things that you find because it's a human brain pattern, you know, to think in terms of quantity and in terms of measurement. It's the cultural construct and the underlying epistemology that guides how you use that knowledge, and that's what I was getting at, you know. So our closest word for science would be knowledge, you know, and that's why many times when you see, you know, you see the word indigenous knowledge is used, and I just used the word science because I wanted to be provocative and to really get that conversation going. But you just said it in the sense that there is a conflict of paradigms, of worldview. Western science has a particular history and tradition and trajectory in its development, even onto the word of how you use the word science. And so I'm trying to get people to think about that in some different kinds of ways, maybe to expand how you understand science. And you know, lengthen and deepen it, so that it becomes, at least so that actually you can actually create space for some new possibilities, some new ways of understanding what you do in science. That's happening already. Many scientists are doing exactly this. They're beginning to take a look at what they do. They're beginning to integrate other kinds of epistemologies, thoughts. They're doing comparative science, you know, as they're doing comparative religion. And so this research has been underway for quite some time. It's just that it's still very boxed within the way that it gets taught in universities and colleges. So much so that you know, a scientist from trained in a certain kind of discipline can't talk to another scientist trained in another discipline. They have completely different languages, and hence you don't have, it's very difficult to do collaboration and interdisciplinary. And that's one of the big issues that has been a part of this global climate change research that's been going on. And scientists can't let go of the definition they have of science, or they have of their discipline. So, you know, we as Indigenous people coming into the space of higher education, we have to do this. We have to define what we're doing for ourselves. That's all I can say.
You brought up metaphors. I kind of associate this with our myths, both personally and culturally, collectively. And I am aware that the university system is to a huge extent based in a lot of kind of patriarchal religion.
Yeah,
so to
yeah,
speak.
yeah.
And as is the rest of our modern society in many ways.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, what's a good way for people with various cultural backgrounds to change our myths so that they integrate with our economy and our legal system, or universities? I mean, is looking back and kind of learning about our where we came from a good way of doing that?
Yeah, that's a starting point. I think he's asking how can in today's world can we, in a sense, use our understanding of the myths of the past, the so-called myths of the past, the metaphors that were used that were primarily nature-centered, and bring them into a contemporary context. You know, the shift happens in terms of the what is the bottom line. Okay, right now our bottom line is very materialistic, very objective, in the sense that it's a science-based story. You know, it's not that the science-based story is not a one good foundation, but it's that it's not broad enough to encompass the subjectivity of human beings and our own histories of being connected to the natural world in an integrated and also sustainable way. And so we have to find ways, and this is my thesis, is we have to find ways, it goes back to this question that was asked about science. We have to expand our notion of what it means to do science. And by expanding and creating a broader space, you have the ability for new metaphors and new ways of understanding and approaching science to come into play. And you create a space for that sense and connection to the natural world to come back once again into the practice of science. At least to be considered, you know. And you know, don't take my word for it. Study all of the environmental philosophy. I mean, there is so much material on this. The other piece of that is that very few college students, unless you're specifically focusing on environmental philosophy, have access to this information. You know, there's almost, and that's because of how closed some of the disciplines tend to get, you know, in terms of just doing a certain kind of story of their discipline. So what I'm advocating is let's open up those boundaries. Let's do more interdisciplinary work. Let's think outside the box again. Let's do some creative thinking about what we do in not only our disciplines, but what we do in higher education as a whole.
You know, going back to the point about whether or not it's idealistic about to reshape the cities, I was wondering if the context of what you were talking about was in terms of being able to create realistic community. And I think one thing is are we capable of being moved enough by what's going on around us to do something about it?
That's true.
And the second question is, you know, do we believe that we're capable of doing something about it? And I think so many of us have sort of, we don't believe that we have the capacity to be able to do something about it in this, what we call, you know, the greatest, freest, most individualistic country where we have. And then even if we do, you know, we are moved enough, we have the capability to be moved to respond. If we do have the capacity or to the belief that we can do something about it, then, you know, do we have the level of community, the alliances that we have to be able to change how it is that we go about things? And I think one of the things that keeps us from doing community is that we're all so busy trying to get our degrees, working, trying to put food on the table, trying to make everything happen, that we live such isolated individual lives from each other. So how do we change the way we do work, the way we do community, the way that we set up our lives, so that we do have a time to be able to build relationships? Because if I understand it, and this is what I'm wondering is, I think what I understand from what you're saying is our cities are too big to be able to do community at a sustainable level because we don't know each other. When I grew up, everybody knew me. If I was acting bad, somebody would smack me upside the head or bring me by the ear to my mom and let me know what it was that I was doing, you know, throwing rocks at the windows or whatever. So how do we go about, you know, resurrecting
communities,
and communities?
Well, my first response is you change the story that you operate from. When you really take a look at this in terms of what kinds of stories you operate from and what kinds of stories guide you, and you do study. I mean, this has been studied by many social scientists who have done this work. David Corton comes to mind as being one of the people who actually was a purveyor of the empire, as he calls it. And that's why I'm using the word empire, because he uses the word empire. But you know, there's a certain narrative and story that has guided since really that coming together of science and technology and politics and business. You know, that foursome in Western culture that then began to look at, and actually even goes before that. You know, the whole notion of the empire creates a hierarchy, where, you know, the top basically benefits from all of the fruits of the labors of the bottom. So it's a triangle, and so there's a certain narrative and story that guides that and keeps that structure in place over, you could even say that the whole notion of empire began maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, when the first empires like Egypt and others, began to be created in this particular kind of hierarchical way. It relates to how kingships were developed and why kingships were developed and how political structures developed around kingship and patriarchy and all those kinds of things. So it has a history. And so that was one history of human culture. There was always been another history of human culture, which has been earth-centered and earth-based, in which there's smaller communities, there are intimate communities, everyone supports each other, there are kernels on the same corn cob, and that kind of human culture has always been here as well. What I'm saying is that we have to find, in a contemporary sense, ways to emulate some of those principles and ideas in a contemporary setting. So cities are too large to be sustainable, but you can break cities into smaller entities and recreate neighborhoods and communities that are self-sufficient and work with each other and integrate with each other, like those kernels on the same corn cob idea. And so that's, you change the story. You begin to change the story, you move the story. In education, you begin to talk for and you begin to advocate for the earth-centered story, which is many environmental educators are doing, today in a variety of different contexts. Many people that are working in community building are doing. Community is the foundation from which then you begin to in a sense, reform, some of our economies, our politics, our ways of looking at the world. So it may seem simplistic, but actually it's not, because the foundation of this whole thing is the community, and reestablishing it in a healthy and revitalized form, and changing the story that community operates from.
Well, and the other thing that's very simple is if we waste all our resources, we're going to die. You know what I'm saying? Like, the world is still going to be here, but we're going to be gone. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Well, these questions are, for me as an educator right now, in my place, in my experience, are kind of the quintessential questions that I'm trying to answer that in my little Native Studies program with my 100 students. But I think, all of us need to think about it in those terms, Yes?
Yeah, I'm almost here checking my own listening, because it seems to me like even when we talk about sustainability, mostly in the Western world, we define it in terms of problems.
Yeah.
We define life in terms of problems. But when I listen to you talk, there's a deep appreciation for life that I'm hearing. And it seems to me that that's another really cornerstone of this work.
Yeah.
In addition to community, it's really a love of the earth.
Yeah, and I think you find that true to be true with most Indigenous people, that we're raised with that kind of embodied, feeling for community and for the natural world. And that's why I say earth-centered. It's an earth-centered subjectivity, and it's an earth-centered psychology. And what's gotten us into trouble, as modern civilization, is that we've moved away. All human cultures at one time were this earth-centered, used this earth-centered psychology. And then all of a sudden we begin to create these empires, and with certain kinds of needs and certain kinds of hierarchies. And we're still playing that story out. And it's a dysfunctional story.
When I have to rescue my brother. I know we can go on and on. And these questions should be really engaged in many of your classroom discussions and groups and dialogues. And that's why we're here. That's why we have these public institutions. But just giving a taste of what's happening at a broader level, the global level. So
I do.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I do have some books available. I just brought 6. These books are out of print, and they're $25 each, so if anyone's interested in taking a look at some of the ideas in both the embedded philosophy as well as the curriculum itself, you're welcome to do so. I'm also going to recommend for all of you, because all of the questions that you've asked, one of my colleagues, David Corton, wrote this book about 10 years ago. It's called The Great Turning, and many of the questions that you've asked are, I think, at least some of the thoughts and perspectives of David Corton will give you some insights into this book as well. So for many ecological educators, David Corton has been one of the most in-depth writers, and given the greatest analysis of empire versus earth-centeredness. And he was a corporate president at one time.
Let's give him a round of applause. There's actually many stories that come from trading in the Santa Fe area and further north into the Taos Pueblo. That we did a lot of trading in, back in the 1800s, and from that came a lot of songs that we were able to share. And of course, songs have changed over time, but it also has contemporary flavors. So this is the same song with some English words. Kids in Santa Fe love that song.